Welcome back to the closing bell. Amid recent market volatility, could investing in space be the new frontier? That is the bet Voyager Space Holdings, the world's first pure-play space holding company that just launched last month, is making. And joining us now to discuss is the chairman and CEO of Voyager Space Holdings, Dylan Taylor. Dylan, great to see you today.
Thank you, Morgan. You too.
Tell us a little bit about this investment vehicle that you have set up and the types of investments that you are now targeting in the space sector.
Sure. So if you look at space, I think both Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs have space as a multi-trillion-dollar market by 2040. But if you look at the landscape, there are some really large players, but many smaller players. So it's very fragmented. The industry really lacks scale. And what we believe to be true is that traditional private equity models that would aggregate market share really aren't well suited for space. The time horizons are long. And also, you want to have operational integration between these companies. So we think an operating company, a holding company, a la Danaher, if you're familiar with that model, is best suited for the space industry.
Yeah, I mean, there are hundreds of space startups that are just mushrooming up right now, and not just here in the U.S., but really around the world right now. Where do you see the greatest opportunities, and are there certain names that you're targeting specifically?
Yeah, certainly in the U.S., also the European region. Basically, the main client base, as you would expect, is the federal government, both in the case of Europe and in the U.S. But there's another huge tailwind here in the U.S., which is the Department of Defense and the newly launched Space Force as well. So I would expect that client base to really drive a lot of the purchasing decisions. And what's nice about the industry is a lot of the revenue is annuity-based. It's contractual over years. And obviously, that's much easier to capitalize.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the Department of Defense. I mean, we had this 70th anniversary in China earlier this week, and this military parade that was put on. Quite a number of new weapon systems that were displayed, that there's been suspicion that they were being developed, but this was the first time we saw them really out in the open, including a new hypersonic ballistic nuclear missile that could potentially reach the U.S. in 30 minutes. What does that do in terms of investment and development of new technologies, since if you want to counter something like hypersonic weapon, you're going to have to do more infrastructure in space?
Right. Well, one of the biggest sectors of space right now is so-called Earth observation. And it used to be those would be optical satellites measuring, things like license plates, the sort of famous surveillance optical satellites. But that has mushroomed into all different kinds of spectra. Infrared, something called synthetic aperture radar, which can look under clouds. So I would expect Earth observation to continue to be a very bullish sector for the industry. And obviously that has national security implications as well.
In terms of commercial space, you can make the argument that we're going to get a first kind of key test of public market investor appetite when Virgin Galactic merges with Social Capital and starts trading here on the New York Stock Exchange.
Right.
How closely are you watching that?
Very closely. In fact, one of the reasons we think Voyager Space Holdings is the right model is really the retail investor doesn't have an opportunity to invest in space. Unless you're an angel investor and writing checks for $50,000, $100,000, it's difficult for your typical retail investor to get exposure. And even the ETFs that have been created, these are really medium to large size space companies that are included in those ETFs. So I think the SPAC that Richard's doing with Social Capital is very smart. I think there'll be a lot of retail interest on that. And in Voyager Space Holdings, in fact, our aspiration is to be publicly traded as well for very similar reasons.